A County.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Welcome to Her Story, the journey to winning a seat at the table. I'm your host, Mary J. Murray, and this program is a series of conversations with inspirational women in leadership roles. Stories are a tapestry of lifelong events and experiences. So let's explore the journey. My guest today is Sonja Klinsky, and she is coming to us from Feversham today in rural or Grey County. And she is the associate professor for the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. And during the pandemic, she has been locked down in Feversham. And so we are so grateful to be able to connect with you today. And Sonja has been an observer to the UN framework for climate change negotiations. And Sonja has expertise in many of the climate change spectrum, but one of the things that she is focusing on is transitional justice. And that is, she is studying historical responsibility and injustice to address collective responsibility to climate change. And Sonja is a very accomplished woman, sitting at many, taking on many leadership roles and sitting at many big tables in terms of climate change. But we know that leadership can start at any age and at any stage. And this is Sonja's journey. Welcome, Sonja, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a nice treat in my day to get to talk about things I care about.
Well, you're very passionate about climate change, and your journey through that has been really astounding. And if you could just give us a little bit of information about your early years growing up in rural Grey County.
Yeah, so I'm actually speaking to you from a house that my parents helped build, and I lived in this house for part of my life, and I'm back here now. It's kind of an unexpected return, but a lovely one. So, you know, growing up in this area, I had no idea where it was going to take me, but it's been really interesting. One of the things that I've learned from being in the United States, actually, is how much the public education system in Canada has helped me. You know, I went to school in Thornbury, which is not a big school. It's a local school. And I went to Meaford to do high school. And, you know, one of the great things about these rural schools is you get to know everybody in the community, from all elements of the community. So you get to have friends who are farming families, and you get to have friends who live in town. And the breadth of the education we get here, and the fact that you actually are integrated with everybody in society, is something that I think we take for granted in Canada. So many of my students in the United States have gone to very specialized schools, and so they never know people who aren't exactly like them. And one of the great things about these rural schools is they have such big catchment areas that everybody in the area goes to that school. And that, for me, I think, is one of the things that has grounded me, because when you're talking about climate change, it affects every aspect of life. And so you have to talk to people who come into the story from every aspect, whether that be people who are farming communities or people who are worried about sort of different aspects of different forms of industry, or people who might be losing land, or people who aren't even sure how it affects them, but they want to do something. Teachers, all element of people come into the space. And so for me, that the breadth that you get through the public education system in Canada, especially in a rural area where you don't have a lot of school choice, is actually a huge strength of the system here that, again, I don't think I might have noticed had I not lived elsewhere for so long. And I think those of us who are here really should pause and appreciate how amazing that system is.
So when you were growing up in this rural area and you have this great catchment, what drew you to science?
That's a great question. So one of the things that's interesting about climate change is that it is science, but it's also about humans. And as a student, I was actually quite torn. I loved math. It was like, I just loved math. I mean, some kids love math. I loved math. It was super fun. But I also loved stories. My mother was an excellent storyteller and loved stories and was a social worker and was deeply connected to people's lives and what made people's lives strong and flourishing or really difficult. And so there was a lot of focus in our family about why and how are people's lives joyful and safe, or why are people's lives not joyful and safe? And what is it that's creating these differences in people's lives? And that plus my interest of science, they sound very different, but actually one of the great things about climate change is that it brings together, wow, we need to understand what's happening in the science because it's going to shape people's lives. And so as a child, I was always very involved in science fair projects, but they were always really weird science fair projects. They weren't just like, I'm going to run this experiment on these plants. It was, I'm going to interview people and find out how they think. I'm going to interview people and think. So it was more like psychology in the sciences as a child. It just seemed very natural to me. And that's where I ended up. My first degree is in environmental science and international development studies. So I was, again, trying to combine how do we think about the planet with how do we think about human well-being and what we need to flourish as humans. But then I left science and I did a master's degree in the arts in a form of human geography, which is all about how people feel in space. And it wasn't until my doctoral degree that I brought them together again. So yeah, that focus on science may have been my grandfather, who actually was a scientist. It may have been just that my family were a little bit nerdy and we liked math. So I don't know exactly.
Well, when you start to integrate all those disciplines and that journey of integration, all those disciplines at different ages and different stages has actually brought you to this transitional justice piece that you have in your climate change spectrum, because you have many expertise in your climate change spectrum that you have spoken about. But during that journey, was there a point where you felt that there was like this pivotal moment that said, yes, climate change is really going to be the focus and I'm just going to pursue that with a passion?
Not to climate necessarily. Probably if I had to pin one very early pivotal moment, it was when I was 12. And my mother had taken me to an anti-racism conference in, I think, Owen Sound. And that was a big deal at the time. We came from a rural area and going to Owen Sound was the big city, right? So we went to Owen Sound to this anti-racism conference run by the Red Cross. And one of the speakers, this was a time when there was civil war happening in a number of countries in Central America, including El Salvador. And one of the speakers talked about the people who were working to protect human rights and how hard it was to protect human rights in this constant context of civil war. And I decided then and there that I would dedicate my life to human rights. And I actually bought a piece of fabric. They were selling these hand-woven pieces of fabric, and it was $10, which was probably my single biggest purchase I had ever made as a child. I bought this piece of fabric for $10 as a way to support this human rights work and a way to remind myself that I wanted to work on human rights. And I still have that piece of fabric hanging in my office. And it reminds me, I'm going to cry, it's so important. It reminds me of that commitment that one's life is to be spent trying to figure out how to contribute to changes that will help others. And so at first, human rights and climate change sound very different. But it was when I was, after my master's degree, and I was working for another organization, and I suddenly realized that many of the climate impacts we're talking about are actually going to undermine people's abilities to live and have human rights. So that could be situations where land is lost permanently, or there's serious droughts and people can no longer farm and they're going to have to leave, and then that leaves them vulnerable to all kinds of situations. It could be situations where you have mass weather events that are just absolutely devastating. And one of the things we know about those is that the level of inequality in a society going in is a fantastic predictor of who's going to be most hurt in any kind of serious climate situation. So if you already have, for instance, a rural community where you have some farmers who are very marginal and you have a serious multi-year drought, it's very likely that those farmers are the ones who are going to have the fewest resources to be able to weather that drought. And they're going to have to leave, migrate to a city. In some parts of the world, we've seen suicides of farmers because they can no longer make a living. And that's where, when you first think about human rights and climate, they sound very separate. But that fundamental commitment to humans and to thinking through what you need to flourish meant that once I started to understand the climate problem, I realized it was a human rights issue and that I actually needed to work on it. And so the real pivot there was actually much earlier, and it was about human rights, not climate. Climate came a little bit later once I had a better understanding of the science.
And that sprung from a very early age, and it was a combination of a number of things, but it's also a reflection of your background. When your mother took you to an anti-racist presentation, and that's what sparked this flame in you going forward to actually marry the two. And it's really interesting how people see it as two different things, and yet you have brought them together and are trying to move that forward in the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, for me, as someone who is curious, maybe that if we think about early experiences, curiosity is really, and again, this goes back to education systems and ensuring that kids are curious. And that's one thing that science can if you have a good science teacher, science is about curiosity. If you have a bad science teacher, it's about memorization and it's scary and it's hard, right? But if you have a good science teacher at the early ages, or a math teacher who makes you see that this is actually about problem solving, it isn't about doing these complicated, difficult things. It's actually about figuring some stuff out and asking questions. Once you're curious, then you're able to really integrate, how is this related to this? Or, that's interesting. If this and this are similar, how is this other thing related? And that's where I think for me, climate has been a real blessing, because it actually connects to almost everything. And for those people like me who are always curious and want to ask, well, why? And what next? And so what then? It's the subject matter that never stops giving. There's always another layer. I'm always having to learn something new, because I've always realized, I hadn't thought of that. I need to go learn about, whatever it is. So yeah, I think that going back down to thinking through early roots, again, that investment in early childhood education and public education, it is centered around curiosity, and it is centered around getting kids to be curious about their world and think that they have a voice in it. To me, it's the root of it, of all of it, and is such an important public institution.
And at what point did you feel that you had a voice in this? Was there a defining moment, or did it just kind of sort of gradually build?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think my parents and my extended family always focused on helping every child know that they did matter and that they did have a voice. So again, it starts from a very early age. And I remember getting into my first energy related debate, I think, was in grade 4, when we had someone from an energy industry come in, and I had some very tough questions for them, and they were not expecting to have a grade 4 kid ask some very tricky questions about infrastructure and energy planning. And they were, who's this kid to ask me questions, right? I mean, that kind of, and I was like, well, of course I'm gonna ask you questions. Like, I have a right to know. I live here. So that, I think, is pretty old. The climate space is an interesting one. And it's, to be honest, it's something that I think anyone who works in climate seriously often questions himself, do I matter? This is a global level issue. I've worked very, very hard to have conversations with many people, to get to many tables, and yet I still have, negligible power in the sense of being able to affect any immediate change. But that being said, again, the longer you work in this area, you realize that if you do want to make change, the fastest way to stop change is to make people feel like they don't have a voice or they don't matter. Apathy is the single biggest danger. And so then it almost becomes a little bit of a game. It's like, oh yeah, you want to take my voice away? Yeah, try it. And it becomes a little bit of a like, no, like, I matter. My voice matters. My thinking matters. And the more I talk to people in the public, the more common I find people like, well, it's so big, I don't know where to start. It's so overwhelming, I don't know where to go. And a lot of my work, especially when in a public context, is trying to help people think through, myself included, where do I have leverage and why and how? And I think teaching has been amazing for that. I work with hundreds of students every year, and they all go off and I don't hear anything from them. And then, a couple years later, I say here, hey, Dr. Klinsky, did you know that after your class, I went and I ended up working for this city and we changed this policy? And then you realize that all these actions that you didn't think mattered. And that reinforces your sense of voice. So I think it is a circular process. You think you have a voice, you use it, you get frustrated. The system tries to tell you don't have a voice. And then you have a choice. You're either silent and you give up your voice, or you dig your heels in and you say, no, I matter. My voice matters. Everyone's voice matters. And then you get your voice back. So I've lost and gained my voice an infinite number of times in this process.
One of the things that sparked the production of this show, called Her Story, The Journey to Winning a Seat at the Table, is that women's voices really matter. And for our viewers, I'm bringing inspirational women onto the program who are reinforcing for the viewers that their voice does matter. And at times you may feel silent or silenced, but you dig your heels in and you make sure that your voice is heard the next time, and you keep trying to move that needle forward in terms of women's voice matters. And it matters in all fields and in all areas of our lives. So I really appreciate the message that you're bringing forth. Just dig in your heels and keep going. You also have influence with your students as you are an associate professor, and you have your classes, and you're planting seeds in the minds of your students that maybe those light bulbs don't go on right away, but as you say, over time, you start to get feedback around how they're implementing some of the ideas that you've put forward.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of seeds. Again, I kind of laugh when I hear people say, oh, well, we can't take whatever climate policy decision it is, because, we're not ready, or it would be too extreme. And anyone who has ever grown up growing anything knows that, well, yeah, if it's August and you didn't plant any hay, you're not going to have any to cut. And so there's that sort of like, things take time, and you have to plan ahead, and you have to be aware that actions that do not seem immediately linked to the final product actually are part of the process. So, any farmer knows that you got to start thinking in January and February about where you're going to get your seed and which fields you want to plant what in, and what's your plan. And someone might say, well, are you being productive? Have you cut any hay this month? And someone asking that in February, you look at them and go, are you crazy? Like, we don't cut hay in February. You plan in February, and you cut in the spring and the summer, right? And it's exactly the same here, is this sort of recognizing that true change takes a long time. And it's trying to think through, where are the different places that I can take different actions that will eventually lead to larger changes? And I think one of the things that's dangerous is, often in our society, we are taught that power means that one person at the top, the person who has the official authority. And yet, that is not how change happens. Change happens through this continual gardening process of planting seeds, tending them, being strategic. You don't want to be dumb about this, but really thoughtful, persistent. That's how change works. And the nice thing about that is that you don't have to be that single person at the top to be seen as powerful. Every single act along the way is actually an act of power. And so people's lives take place in many different locations, and we have different kinds of power and different kinds of influence and different kinds of contributions to make. And that's a good thing. So I think one of the things, especially in women's lives, is we are often put in places where we're told, oh, that's not that important, right? Whatever you're doing, whether it's taking care of children or doing, early childhood education, the vast number of people doing early childhood education continue to be women. And yet what I'm saying is that's probably one of the most powerful places. And so it's not to say, oh, just do what, women have been told to do, but to remember that in all of these places are huge power, and you have choices about how do I use the power I have available to me right now to make change. And it's the accumulation of those many, many, many points that really, I think, is where true change comes from. It has to come from the ground up. And so I think that goes back to your question of voice, which is just to remember that each of us does have a voice and has choices and has opportunities to use it at all of these living levels.
Well, I think that it is absolutely essential for women to be at decision-making tables, a gender balance, because women come with different perspectives. And I know that the number of voices in the climate change field, and there's a lot of debate that's always going on, and unfortunately it gets politicized. But what we have in our community here in Grey County is grassroots, people coming together and working on climate change, from what people can do individually to what we can do collectively. And your voice in that is so powerful and so important to keep us all moving forward in this, and each one of us contributing however we can to better understanding climate change and taking it more seriously, as this is a global initiative, a global impact. And as you say, it affects all aspects of all our lives.
Yeah, I mean, and I, don't want to make sure I'm super clear when I say, use whatever power you have. That's awesome, but also don't feel constrained by it, right? So, not very many rural kids from Grey County end up at UN conferences, and more should. Not that that's the only source of power, but I would hate for local kids to feel like, oh, I could never go have that role, or I could never go be important to this conversation. And that's, I think, where we have a problem. And so it's both taking whatever position you're in, but also really saying, no, I actually could go do this thing, and I'm going to try to figure it out. And there are definite roadblocks, and it's not a fair playing field. That's just the truth. And in some ways, I have some privileges, unlike some of my colleagues who are Black and have had to deal with huge racism in their position. I haven't had to deal with that, but I have had to deal with a lot of gender discrimination in my life. And again, that's a digging your heels thing and saying, no, wait a minute, you're making me feel bad here, not because I did something wrong, but because this system doesn't treat women equally. And so, no, I am not going to be silenced because of this. This is not my fault. This is the fault of the system, and I will try to change the system, but I will not take this on as, not being nice or not sitting down and listening when you're supposed to, right? There are times when you need to be a little assertive.
Well, I think we're learning a lot from you, Sonja. I just want to sort of encapsulate what you've been talking about, because I've taken this quote directly from work that you have done. Collaborations have sought to generate theoretically sound and politically relevant proposals addressing justice and fairness embedded in climate policy and decision making. And I think that just kind of wraps and summarizes everything that really we've been talking about today. And just as we are sort of wrapping up a little bit here, I wanted to ask you, what actually brings you joy in your life?
I think what the biggest source of joy for me is feeling like I am part of a much larger effort. I am not the only one talking about climate change. There are so many of us. I'm not the only one talking about human rights. There are so many of us. I'm not the only one talking about the importance of public institutions. There are so many of us. And again, you get joy when you think through, yes, these are my efforts, and they're maybe not as big as I wish they could be, but I know that they're important because they fit in with this other person's efforts, and they, leverage this other person's efforts, and they complement this other person's efforts. And together there is a larger voice here. And that's that sense of being part of something larger than yourself, which I think is really the ultimate sort of joy in this space.
And do you have a phrase, just very quickly, do you have a phrase that rolls around in your head every day that propels you forward?
It's one I learned from my brother, who was ill for a long time. And he would say every morning, the day, the work, the energy. And it's a way of just saying, what has to happen today? And this is today. And what energy do I have? And I don't need to get all stressed and worried about what happened yesterday. I'm going to focus on what I can do with my energy today that contributes to the work.
Wow, that's amazing. Oh, well, we're out of time. So thank you very much, Sonja, for joining us today. And join us next time on Her Story, The Journey to Winning a Seat at the Table.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
Are you the type who would keep going or stop? It's not easy to stop when you have an addiction. Legalizing cannabis won't stop addiction. It trivializes its consumption. Let's be vigilant. If you need help, visit portage.ca.
We're trying to locate a Donnie Wee Boy.
You let it be known you're looking for a wee boy. I'll find you.